Well, good morning, everyone. Once again, thank you very much indeed for joining us for this interesting seminar. My name is John Bachtler. I'm a director of the European Policies Research Centre, which is based at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow and at the Technical University of Delft in the Netherlands. Of course, in normal circumstances, we'd have been delighted to welcome you to either Glasgow or Delft and to have the opportunity not just for this webinar, but also the opportunity to network a little bit over coffee and lunch. But thanks for taking advantage of the virtual opportunities to join us. And we have a double act today, a presentation by Wolfgang Petzold and Magdalena Sapała on unanimity, flexibility, conditionality, how the EU budget 2021-2027 was negotiated and what it means for regions and cities. An ideal time now at the conclusion, more or less, of the budget and legislative negotiations to look back on what we've learned about the narratives and development of the outcomes that we see before us. Before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to inform you that the meeting is being recorded, which means that you and your colleagues have the opportunity to follow the meeting at a later stage. The recording will be made available on our YouTube channel and then shared with you by email. We'd also encourage you to use Twitter to share your thoughts on the webinar. Of course, by now, I think everyone will be familiar with the protocols for Zoom meetings, so I don't need to go through these in detail. But just a reminder to keep your microphone on mute if you're not speaking, to use the blue hand with Zoom, with the blue hand function, if you'd like to make an intervention. But we'd prefer you to perhaps wait until after the speakers have contributed before you intervene. And of course, please feel free to use the chat functions to send questions or comments, since we'll open things up after the two presentations for a Q&A. So the presentations will be in two parts, following one on from each other. But first of all, let me introduce Wolfgang Petzold, who is Deputy Director for Communications at the European Committee of the Regions, a post he's held since 2008, or rather he's been part of the European Committee of the Regions since 2008, before which he was a European Commission official for 10 years, among others as Deputy Head of Communication in DG Regio, and previously working for about a decade in regional ministries in Germany. Wolfgang has a degree in sociology. He's part-time lecturer for European Studies at the University for Applied Sciences in Bremen, and publishes articles and books on EU affairs, in particular on cohesion policy. And apart from that, those formal background qualifications, I would say he's one of the foremost knowledge brokers on cohesion policy in the EU, and does a fantastic job in terms of brokering between academia and policy in terms of interesting literature and outputs on relating to cohesion policy. So with that background, let me give the floor first of all to Wolfgang.
Yeah, thanks, John, for the introduction. I will share my screen now. And like to say, first of all, thanks for the invitation to EPRC. The last time, indeed, in a physical meeting, I remember very well a haggis and whiskey tasting sometimes somewhere outside Glasgow. And I look very much forward to something similar in the near future, let's hope. I'm quite grateful, and it's also challenging to speak to such an knowledgeable and experienced audience. And I'm also grateful, as you said, John, that Magdalena has on short notice signed in and will give her views on the views of the Parliament and the works of the Parliament. And I'd like to say, before you introduce her, that Magdalena is in fact, as the whole EP EP Research Service, one of the best sources one can have about the developments in the Parliament, and I very much admire what the Research Service has achieved over the last couple of years. So thanks for that, Magda, and I will show one of your works during my slide presentation, which I'm starting now. Yeah, this is a moment when three personalities, well known, I think, to the audience, stroke one of the deals. I'm not sure whether it was the budget deal, but this is how the times are now. And well, unanimity, flexibility, and conditionality are the terms, one could even say, for which each of the representatives here have certain thoughts, not always the same thoughts, but they have to struggle through this, and this is part of the whole story, I'd say. To give you an idea of what happened when, indeed, as we said before, the seminar started among us ourselves. In these days, budget negotiations don't stop. You can see here the timeline for the ones that concluded in December, indeed. So these light blue areas mean that something has happened before, which is, I'd say, even as important as the concrete acts, meaning the proposals, the negotiations in the different institutions, and the final conclusions, which is the pre-legislative phase and the post-legislative phase if you only look at the budget, because for the first time, we now have a situation when all the necessary legal acts, we're talking about 40 to 50 legal acts to run the EU programs haven't even been published yet. That has never happened before. Also, never ever before there was such a long negotiation period. If you count it only from the Commission's proposal, all the Commission does or did, I mean, the major events here are marked in green, from 2nd May to the 7th December 2020 agreement, publication of the legal acts on the budget and the own resources. Those are 32 months. And yeah, never ever before have negotiations lasted so long. Some people might say, yeah, hold on a second, we had a negotiation standstill in 2019 because of the European elections that you may not want to count, and then came COVID. But I'd say that now that we have seen 5 or 6 of such negotiations, there's always this kind of last-minute drama that drives the whole process through. So there are some known facts like negotiation boxes. I would count 3.5. The first one of 2018 wasn't quite a box because it was empty. There were no figures in it. And the major breakthrough was, of course, the longest ever, again, negotiations in the European Council, 4 days and nights before the agreement on the 21st of July, Belgium National Day, could be concluded, and was then the basis for the still then ongoing negotiations between Council and Parliament, of course. Yeah, what's happening now may be also interesting, and everybody is aware, but one legal act on the own resources is still in the making, to say so, because the national parliaments have to accept it and ratify the own resources decision, which is a council decision. So this is still ongoing. The last time I looked, Magda might know the precise number, but there were only, I think, a week ago, 6 or so parliaments who had ratified the own resources decision. So that is not yet even hammered into legal stone. I don't know, maybe some of the guys there online know more about it, that possibly in March we will see the regulations, so mainly for cohesion policy, the common provisions regulation and the funds regulations being published in the official journal, of course, then with retroactivity. It's a simplified picture for those who are really nerds and junkies of this. It's, as I said in the beginning, it's a didactical and visual presentation, so I try to make it as simple as possible. Well, I just said something that doesn't come quite true when you see this image. This, John and Carlos, and I don't know whether Fiona is online, is the summary of your 2013 book on one slide. I mean, this was, it's maybe a little bit exaggerated, but I think that this book that you published, John, Carlos, and Fiona, on the reform process and mainly the interconnectedness of the budget negotiations and the cohesion policy negotiations were really a breakthrough and shed so much light on something that has only before that been in parts analyzed. So I think we have, if I may say, as an academic record now that the budget negotiations and the cohesion policy negotiations are firmly interwoven, and one could even criticize that to some degree because both of them are based on different decision-making rules. On the left side, the budget, as most of you know, is based on unanimity, hence the title of today's webinar, meaning that the Parliament has only little to say. On the contrary, since I think the early 2000s, all the legal acts on the cohesion fund regulations are, including the one that was the last one on the cohesion fund itself, are under co-decision or ordinary legislative procedure and have a rather different dynamic of negotiations between the Council and the Parliament, the two legislators. And that causes a problem, and the problem is, if you want, in the middle boxes, the two red middle boxes, where you have on the left side under unanimity, one of the thematic blocks on the common provisions regulations, namely block 8, taken out of the, to some degree, taken out of the co-decision procedure and decision-making process. And this thematic block is on finances. So everything that is kind of, you know, important for fund managers, important for the negotiators, is of course linked to the other thematic blocks, which talk more about detailed rules on what to spend the money on how to do that and how to do the programming and who has to say what and when. So that is something where I think your publication has made clear that there's a problem there. And I think Magdalena will possibly speak about this in greater clarity. But this has been the process, and it has been rather similar to what we have seen in previous rounds with these thematic blocks going through mainly the common provisions regulations. More details are to follow on another slide. What is also known is that we have these camps of friends and frugals and promoters this time around of the rule of law. This slide, as you can read, is designed after a presentation of these schools of thought or camps, which was done by Politico, the news agency for Brussels people, to say so. And it pictures the proposal made in February by Charles Michel, the president of the European Council, which was very close to what the Commission had proposed. And it's based on these figures of 1% or 1.1% of GNI as the ceiling for the overall budget. I think we have seen some of these camps, names are new, but it is basically the division between the so-called net payers and the so-called net beneficiaries. There's a whole discussion on already the naming or the branding of these schools of thought or camps, and they have been, for the first time, maybe a little bit more dynamic. As you can see, there were overlaps. Germany, the country I know best, with initially being part of the Frugal Five, but then changing a little bit camps and joining, especially on the next generation EU funding forces, again with France, I'd say, so to have a kind of stable French-German axis in the whole process. But initially they were signing up to the Frugal Five when the finance minister, Helmut Scholz, said that he is a friend of the 1% ceiling, something that changed dramatically. He is now walking around and says that Europe had its Hamiltonian moment, and we are now also ready to even have higher ceilings of spending for the EU in the future. Well, we'll see how that works further on. Now I wanted to present you a fine piece of art that Magda is definitely responsible for. So I try to show you this also online. But first of all, how to read this. I wonder whether all of you have seen it. The colors are depending, you see it on the legend on the right side, on the so-called headings of the EU budget. And you read it from top to down. So from top, from the initial proposal in May, and to down, even the top up of 16 billion, I believe, that the Parliament was able to negotiate after the 21st of July European Summit conclusions. And what is really, again, a nice piece of web designers. I wonder whether you can see the internet now. Is it visible to you? Okay, I just need to move it a little bit down. All right. Just want to show how this works, because Magda, did you invent this? Was it you?
Well, we have a team of technicians who are working with us. And of course, yes, this, yeah, all these moves, only not because I made it, but of course we have to give them the figures and control everything.
I just mouse over the cohesion and resilience and values part of it. And when you click on that, what you can see is how this developed over the negotiation process. So here you are again and back in the beginning with the initial proposal, and then you see all the developments and you can see where the money goes, at least in theory, as regards the budgetary agreement, in terms of heading of the EU budget. So not quite where the money goes in reality, meaning to which member state it goes. But let me continue this. I really think that this is magnificent. I'd like more of this kind of transparency on how the budget works. And I think it would be, normally it would be a job of the European Commission of DG Budget to do that, but well done. Now, here's the final result in 2 rings, if you want. So the inner ring is what we have learned is the Next Generation Europe. And mainly this is based, as you can see, to 90-40% on the so-called resilience, recovery and resilience facility, which is split between grants and loans. When you go back to the initial proposal of the Commission, one of the narratives were that a more simplified and modern budget should be the objective of the process. And I do think that, well, to some degree you have, if you say modern is more money for policies like research, Erasmus and others, you can see that indeed they were able to reduce the cohesion allocations and the agricultural allocations, sometimes blamed as old policies, that they have achieved this to some degree, mainly for the agricultural allocations, but not as ambitious as it was initially announced, which speaks again for something that we know as path dependency of this negotiation process, mainly based on unanimity and the veto power that each member state has. The next 2 slides show you a little bit where regions might come in and might be able to absorb the money in the sense that they can also manage it. When I say can and might and possible, this depends very much on the way in which the member states are programming this, and the experts among you know this, of course. So simply put, the federal countries have a higher degree of regional programs, whereas the unitarian and smaller member states don't. But this is not guaranteed, and my fear is that the level of programs, both in numbers, but also in terms of share of any of these funds, will go down. If you look into the last period, which I did a couple of years ago, and I think the figures haven't changed quite, we had for the ERDF, the Cohesion Fund, the Social Fund, and the Rural Development Fund about 450 programs. 70% of these were managed by regions, but they were only worth 1/3 of the overall allocation. So more regional programs, smaller ones, the big ones, mainly the infrastructure programs, for example, in Poland and Spain, managed by the national authorities. So one, I would say, would have to watch that figure carefully to see what happens. It would be an indicator of, could be interpreted as an indicator of whether or not there's a higher degree of regional involvement. And sadly, of course, this time around, agriculture has left the camp. This has a permanent ping pong over the periods, and most of you will be aware of it. But very early, agriculture, mainly the Rural Development Fund, decided not to go under the roof of the Common Provisions Regulation, which they were under in the previous period and not in the one before that. So they always go and come back. And this time around, it's even worse because DG Agriculture has decided to just prolong the existing programs for 2 years and you know, extend the duration by using the funds and doing only little change to it. So this is really a completely different approach, and has, before the proposal was done, led to some eyebrows risen in some DGs, mainly in DG Regio, who had hoped that the continuation of all the territorial programs, including the ones for rural development, could continue and would serve the coherent approach towards the territory. So that's not going to happen. That's not going to happen. And that's sad. And I can also add that not only the Committee of the Regions, but mainly the Parliament has fought for that for quite a while during the trilogues to get the Rural Development Fund back under the roof of the Common Provisions Regulation and to have a more coherent approach again to territorial funding programs. Not going to happen. This is own work, and I would just like to point to a mistake that I couldn't quite solve because I couldn't get hold of all the figures. The mistake lies in the fact that some of these, first of all, it shows the different funds of the so-called pre-allocated EU programs, and it shows the different columns, mainly red meaning cohesion, green meaning agriculture, and the top orange is standing for the RRF, this time without the loans. Side remark, it's not sure whether all countries will pick up the loans. At least 2 I know will probably not make use of the loans, as you may be aware of. So the 2 different orange colors means that there are 2 allocations based on different indicators. The first one that is negotiated now covers the years 21-22, and the lighter upper one will be allocated based on different indicators in 23. So this represents, as it's marked here, 61% of the total, 61% of the total. So what's not covered are, again, the RRF loans, but also programs like Horizon, Erasmus, and so on, where the national allocation only follows individual decisions throughout the programming process. And again, this can't be pre-allocated. Also, all the external programs and, of course, the administrative budget making 6% of the total MFF is not factored in here. Usually this is factored in for Luxembourg, but I wouldn't do that. So what you can see is that, in fact, the Recovery and Resilience Facility makes quite a difference. Sorry, I need also to add another mistake. I did this as if it were, as if the RRF were kind of spread over the whole period, which is not the case. The last payment for the Recovery and Resilience Facility will be made in 2026. And so it's not quite correct to do it like this, but it's a way to show how different the intake is, and also to show that indeed Italy, Spain, and France are quite profiting from this on top of everything package through the Next Generation Europe program and funding. This map is one that was done by me, so it's also full of mistakes, but it gives you it gives you an idea for those programs, and this is only 42% of the total, where the EAGF, so the Agricultural Guarantee Fund, is not factored in because this would never be, let's say, a program that will be in the hands of regions or cities. So this is everything that could go under regional management. And it shows, as the indicator here is the total allocation divided by the number of people, divided by the number of years per country. So you see that the Baltics and Greece have indeed the highest per capita injection, or they can expect so. And I would just like, because we are so updated, to share a publication that I came across through a tweet by Magda this morning, if that works. So, because this morning, in fact, I know it's not there, so I need to share it first with you and then click on it. No, I do it differently. Sorry for that, sorry for the hiccup. I share, after my presentation, the link to the publication done by Jacques Delors, because they also did a similar exercise and indeed allocated funding per head, but also absorption rates of the previous program, and make quite a critical stand, I believe, on whether or not all this money will, member states and regions will be able to absorb it. So worth reading, and I share the link in the chat once this is over. Don't worry, I'm coming to the end, John. This is also something that tries to summarize the different stages of one of the most important, if not the most important, common provisions regulation, compares the Commission proposal, the final version, and the period before that. It is also covered, very well covered by some EPRC and also EPRS publications. And from a former fund manager, I just summarized from my perspective what are the most important issues in this regulation. I don't go through the details. You can read that because we will share the PowerPoint afterwards. But what's most important, maybe interesting for you, is that indeed, when you see the geographical concentration of cohesion policy funding, there's a higher degree now for the less developed regions. So for those with the GDP per head of capita measured against the EU average of below 75%, there are lower cappings and higher degrees of lower degrees of capping and safety nets as compared to the previous period. So it all gets a little bit more competitive, if you want, and this is mainly true for the larger part of the EU territory designed as the more developed regions. So they really lost basically 1/3 or close to half of their funding. And this will also be interesting to see whether these countries, the country I know best, Germany again, will still go for regional programs for all the funds or not, because the little amounts might sometimes lead to a national program. I can't imagine that for Germany, but I can imagine it for Austria again, who has switched to this regional chapters modus for the ERDF already a couple of years ago. You can also quite easily see what the Parliament was able to negotiate and change. So that would be an argument for the negotiations also being driven by flexibility, at least when it comes to co-decision. Just see that, for example, the decommitment rule proposed by the Commission to go back to N+2, meaning money lost after the second year of any annual commitment, has been changed again back to N+3, so more time and a higher risk for not absorbing the money. And technical assistance was also increased compared to the, so that's the second lowest point from below. You see the technical assistance ceilings that were proposed lower than the final outcome was. Again, this common provisions regulation is not yet public, like the fund regulations. So these are things that were all laid down in the council conclusions. So if you want the package 8 or the chapter 8 of the negotiations, and I think Magda told me last time, I didn't count the pages, that of the 58 pages, 18 are only full of these technical details of council conclusions, which one can doubt is not really a legal act in itself. I think I have 2 more slides, John, if that's fine. This one I've just updated for the sake of this presentation today. The most important thing I want to point to is that cohesion policy is always quite successful in getting its share of the budget negotiated. So the yellow column shows you, compared to the initial proposal of the Commission and the cuts in percentage. So the Commission is proposing 100 and they arrive at 95, for example, how the overall cut was and how big was the cut for cohesion policy. So the second figure is the percentage cut of cohesion policy. And I calculated, again, I take all the criticisms for that indeed there was no reduction if you count React EU into it, which is a bit like tricky. But the overall cuts Commission proposal compared to the conclusions of the European Council and the final budgetary act were definitely higher. And that's interesting. So cohesion is a survivor in difficult times. And one might ask the question, why is that so? Final slide. That's a little bit the summary of what I already said. So we had quite long negotiations. We had the usual dynamics, path dependency was the rule, but we had also co-decision and quite a successful and well-prepared parliament, I'd say. We had a strong regional lobby led by the Committee of the Regions, so-called Cohesion Alliance, which has also joined forces with the association representing regional and local interests. And they have argued mainly alongside the positions of the Parliament and some member states for example, higher co-financing rates or higher technical assistance rates and everything else. So the result is a decreased MFF, if you like the term. But indeed, due to COVID, the first ever loans-based additional budget, which brings the injection into member states up to 1.5, or even if you count the shorter period for the Next Generation Europe and the Recovery Fund, even into a higher degree. I saw some figures done by Bruegel, the Brussels think tank, who say now that the injection in countries like Bulgaria also is 12% of their national GDP. I'm not sure whether this is true, but it's definitely higher, and it definitely poses a risk in addition to, for example, the non-absorbed funds, which some people say are in the area of about 50% of the funds of the funding of the previous period that haven't been paid out yet. So implementation will cause problems, that's for sure, and a drop in the glass of water of higher funding is a possible trend to less regionalization of programs and the loss of rural development, as I said, and that I didn't go into details for that one, but we can discuss during the debate that the social fund goes more national than before. So one will have to see whether or not there will be, for example, regional ESF programs at all. I believe that yes, but I do think that DG Employment will put a lot of pressure of having a simpler approach and not so many. I think they had around 100 regional programs last time, not so many regional programs in the new period. Thanks for listening. I didn't look at the watch, John. Was I too long? Possibly yes, but I was colorful, as I promised, visual, and not too precise. I'm happy to answer any questions. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Wolfgang, and a virtual round of applause for that really interesting presentation, which, with your characteristically excellent graphics, provides some good overviews of the different parameters of the negotiations and the outcome, and a lot of food for thought, particularly in that last slide, that you had that we'd like to, I think, come back to during the discussion. We just had one comment during the during your presentation from Stefano Messina, who suggested adding Belgium as promoters of the rule of law on your Venn diagram, I think.
I think I have to speak to the 4 Belgium regions before I do that.
Okay, good. Well, look, before we open up the floor, let's go on to our second presenter, and let me introduce Magdalena Sapała, who's already got a number of citations from Wolfgang in the course of his presentation. Magdalena is a policy analyst at the European Parliamentary Research Service, EPRS, quite close to EPRC, although we'd be glad to be in your company, where your research focuses on the budget of the EU. Magdalena has closely followed negotiations on the current 2014 to 2020, or the previous 2014 to 2020 MFF and the new 2021 to 2027 one. She's a former parliamentary advisor to one of the MEPs and latterly as a researcher at the European Parliament's think tank. Magdalena has a PhD in economics and was a fellow of the Jean Monnet program, and she's held postdoctoral research positions at the Institute for European Studies at the Free University of Brussels and the European Studies Department of the Poznan University of Economics. And I have to say, I can really second what Wolfgang said about the quality of the briefings, Magdalena, that you and your colleagues produce in the EPRS. In a relatively short time, they've become invaluable briefings, I'm sure, particularly for the MEPs, but also for the wider community that has an interest in cohesion policy. So really great work. Well, without further ado, let me give you the floor for the next part of the presentations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you very much, and welcome to all participants. I am delighted to take part in this webinar today, especially because I have a lot of respect for the EPRC and your, John, contribution to the debates on cohesion policy and your role in building a knowledge-based, a research-based cohesion policy in the European Union is very significant. So thank you very much. Wolfgang gave us an excellent overview of this highly complex process and the outcomes. And I'm going to complete this picture with a view from the European Parliament. And first, I will unpack the MFF package and explain this difference that was already mentioned by Wolfgang between the formal and factual role of the European Parliament in the negotiations. Second, I will highlight some elements of the Parliament's strategy during the negotiation. And third, I will present the Parliament's achievements. So you might have heard already that someone in the European Commission, I think, first counted that the EU costs us slightly less than 1 coffee per day. And why then we spend so many months, over 30 months, on negotiating this small budget? And well, you all know that the picture is more complex than just the MFF itself, because we are dealing during these negotiations with the whole package called the MFF package. And with, I think, when I recall the previous negotiations on the MFF and these negotiations, this package is more complicated, more complex. So what we find there in this package, there is the MFF itself, this is the expenditure side of the budget, the revenue of the budget, so the own resources, and now, of course, also changes to the system and enabling borrowing operations to finance the recovery program. Then we have the rule of law regulation. This is also something new now, and the recovery plan, NGEU, Next Generation EU. And the last but not least, what was already mentioned by Wolfgang, we have more than 40 legislative acts establishing funding programs, so-called sectorial regulations. And they, among them, I think 4 concern cohesion policy. Many of them are still under the negotiations. So I think in April, cohesion documents will be finalized and published. Formally, all these elements are adopted in different legislative procedures with different roles for the Parliament, for the Council, and the Commission. And you know that the Parliament's consent is necessary for the MFF regulation, but on the side of revenue, Parliament is only consulted. And then again, on all these sectorial regulations, the Parliament acts on equal footing with the Council. But the difference between there is this difference between the formal procedures and the political procedure leading to the adoption. And whereas the formal procedures do not foresee any role for the European Council, for the leaders gathered in the European Council summit, in practice, we know, and I heard that you wrote a book about it, the European Council plays a key role in this procedure. What is more, the European Council decides not only about the overall amounts of the MFF and per heading, but also on many details on the allocation methods and the implementation modalities of different funds. So they enter in the ordinary legislative procedure where the Parliament should act on equal footing with the Council. As a result, we have this extensive European Council conclusions on 68 pages, where there is 20%, I calculated 20% increase in comparison with the previous MFF negotiations. And on at least 18 pages, indeed, the cohesion policy is defined, and the European Council included the definition of cohesion goals, distribution of allocation, eligibility criteria, methodology for allocation, additionality, and so on and so forth. So a lot of details, and this is from the European Parliament's perspective, limiting its role. So the issue is not only the unanimity and this, in the eyes of the Parliament, extensive role of involvement, the degree of the involvement of the European Council leaders, but the scope of the package decided. Now, what does the European Parliament think of it? European Parliament opposes this and has on many occasions expressed its dissatisfaction in its resolutions about the involvement of the European Council in the process, and especially on the fact of this exercising legislative role. And the Parliament is of the opinion that, here I quote, the conclusions represent no more than a political agreement between the heads of state and government. The programs financed under the MFF have to be agreed by Parliament as co-legislator. The Parliament say co-decision provisions in co-decision negotiations. Well, it's of course difficult for the Parliament to manage this, but you may wonder how the Parliament has prepared and how the Parliament tried to influence this process nevertheless. The European Parliament strategy was multi-dimensional, and I'm not attempting here to assess it or present in detail. I will tell you about some aspects that deserve, I think, particular attention. So the Parliament, first of all, had to ensure that the majority of its component members supported the result of the negotiations. And actually, first they had to ensure that there is a majority support for the negotiating position. So that was a very important task, and this majority had to be had to continue, had to be ensured until the end of these negotiations. So from the beginning until the very last vote. Therefore, there was the whole internal structure prepared for the organization of these negotiations. There were representatives of all political groups involved in the so-called contact group. There were representatives of the main political groups in the main negotiating team of the Parliament. So there was an EPP represented, SND, Renew, Green, Conservatives. The rule of law was negotiated by a separate team of negotiators, and of course all legislative acts, all these additional sectorial regulations were negotiated or are still negotiated, many of them, by individually organized groups of teams of negotiators. And this support, this organization of negotiations and the support for the Parliament's position has been stable, even at the moment when there were European elections in May 2019, this didn't destabilize the whole support, and the negotiating position was then confirmed by the new Parliament. So there was this continuity of this support. Another important element of the strategy is an early and good preparation and active participation in the process in every possible way. So the Parliament voted 8 resolutions from March 2018 until December 2020. The first resolution was in March, so still before the Commission presented its proposal, where the Parliament outlined its expectations for the next MFF. But actually, the work started already with the midterm review of the old MFF. And then 6 months after the presentation of the proposal in November 2018, the Parliament voted its so-called midterm report. So this was the Parliament's negotiating position. And I'd like to draw your attention to this document, because I think it's not only a politically well-structured and quite clear view on the future of Europe, what we want, but also there is this attached to the resolution is this extensive annex in which the Parliament included concrete modifications to the proposal on the MFF and several tables, including detailed figures, detailed amounts calculated and asked or demanded by the Parliament. And this calculation, these amounts, the result of this, the result presented in this document was built in a way bottom up. So the Parliament first discussed the priorities and took into account also commitments, most of them made by the member states themselves, and calculated how much it would cost. And in the end, the Parliament said, well, okay, if we want to fulfill all this, we need at least at minimum 1.3% of EU GNI. And third element, I think, of the strategy, I think what actually I just thought about it when Wolfgang spoke. The Parliament really insisted on transparency during these negotiations. So as much as we could, we also tried to contribute to this transparency at the EPRS the Secretariat of the Budget Committee, my colleagues there really worked hard on different analyses, and they published them, while the Commission didn't really publish for very long, maybe until now, the detailed list of programs hasn't been, the final version hasn't been published by the Commission. So we also tried to help with this, and we published very detailed analysis, and we will continue doing this. Let's now move to the results of the negotiations. So what actually the Parliament considers its achievements. We of course have to look at these achievements from the perspective of these limitations I mentioned at the beginning, related to the actual course of the negotiations and this involvement of the European Council and the rigidity of the Council of the European Union, and especially the German presidency during the final stage of the negotiations. So the achievements there are, I think, in the area of expenditure, revenues, and then there are some horizontal aspects. I begin with the expenditures, and I will show you. I'll share my screen now to show you one slide. These are our favorite. I don't know if you have seen already our publication. This is our favorite way to picture the MFF, the bubbles. And on the top right corner, you see the small bubble. Actually, there are 4 billion and 11 billion. Together, it makes 15 top-ups. So I begin with this. So in the formal negotiations with the Council, represented by German presidency in the autumn last year, after the European Council's meeting in July, the Parliament actually was faced with a very rigid position, as I said, and the presidency didn't want to change almost a single digit in the numbers included in this very long council conclusions. And then Parliament, the only way to get something, to win in terms of expenditures of the budget was to focus on the programs that usually in the budgetary negotiations between the member states fall in the budget other. So these are programs, programs well known to you, such as Horizon Europe, Erasmus, Border Fund, Invest EU, what else was there? Health Program, Creative Europe. All these programs which the Parliament concerns, really programs with the European added value. And those programs were, some of them very much cut during the negotiations between the member states. And here the Parliament managed during the negotiations to obtain 15 billion to reinforce 10 such EU flagship programs on top of the amounts agreed by the European Council in July 2020. This top-up is only about 1% of the total MFF, and will be financed, and this is, I think, interesting and important from the Parliament's perspective. They will be financed mostly from the special mechanism now included in the MFF regulation, the mechanism linked to the proceeds from competition fines collected by the European Union. So there will be a possibility to reuse this money, which previously reduced the European member states' contribution to the budget. Now they will be reused in part, and to reinforce these 10 EU flagship programs. I think that this is also important from the citizens' perspective, because these programs are also in many ways they answer their answer to citizens' expectations. I read the recent results of the Eurobarometer, where the citizens, not surprisingly, say that the EU should spend more money on health. And the EU health program, thanks to the European Parliament's efforts, will be tripled in comparison with what the European Council proposed. Now, what about the total amount agreed? The Parliament emphasizes that thanks to this small top-up negotiated, the final ceiling of the MFF will exceed slightly in real terms the 2014-2020 MFF. And if we look at these numbers with the Next Generation EU, it's of course additional 5 annual budgets that we will have to spend properly in next years. So all in all, it will be about almost 2% of EU GNI. This is much more than the Parliament 1.3 at the beginning. But of course, the conditions and the situation has changed in the meantime. On next point on my list of achievements on expenditure side is something that was mentioned by Wolfgang. Spending for agriculture and cohesion is maintained at the similar level to the previous MFF. And I would like to remind you that the first proposal of the European Commission in 2018 cut cohesion by 10% and agriculture by 15%. So this reduction has been mitigated. Next on the list of the achievements is the Just Transition Fund. We should not forget that this is the Parliament's baby, because it was born, the idea was born in the European Parliament and then was formally proposed by the European Commission at the beginning of last year. Child guarantee is similar. We're speaking of babies and children. You may actually hear my children here at the back. They are making some noises. I'm sorry for this if it disturbs. So child guarantee, which will be now part of the European Social Fund. And last but not least on the list of expenditure is the flexibility of the whole MFF, which will be enhanced. And so we will have more money for unexpected crisis. And this, as you may remember, was a big issue in the previous negotiations on 2014-2020. Now this, I think, didn't play a big role in the negotiations, was pretty easy to obtain. On the revenue side, we have a legally binding plan for introduction of a basket of new own resources, beginning with resources based on plastic, which should start this year. And another element of the revenue side is what I already mentioned, the possibility to use the revenue from the competition fines. So this is maybe more technical, but still quite important, and it's something new for the management of the budget. And among the horizontal aspects, there is a 30% target on spending on climate, 10% on biodiversity, no harm principle, some progress in gender budgeting, midterm review and revision will stay and should be conducted in a couple of years. And I think very important still for the Parliament part concerns the governance of Next Generation EU. So the role of the Parliament should be enhanced in scrutiny and oversight of expenditure, and the rule of law regulation and all these details. The Parliament is of an opinion that now this is a better regulation than it was proposed by the Commission. To conclude, is it overall a good result or not? Well, I think it should be assessed against the expectations that the Parliament had, and I think these expectations also a bit evolved during this whole process, and they changed. And here my answer would be, on one hand, we could look at this as a pessimist, but then again, we could look at it as an optimist. So as an optimist, the optimist will say it has been a bumpy and long road with many turning points. And similarly to the previous negotiations, the unanimity rule, the involvement of the European Council delayed the process, complicated it, and just the retour principle prevailed again, and the modernization of the budget is only on the margins somewhere. So business as usual. But the optimist, and I think I'm one of the optimists, will notice that in these adverse conditions and with limited possibilities to negotiate, the Parliament has agreed the MFF, which is with the top-up, as I said, not smaller than the previous MFF, adjusted to Brexit, of course. And in addition, a number of seemingly minor battles have been won by the Parliament, such as this mechanism for financing flagship programs from competition funds, or this legally binding plan for the introduction of own resources. And much more has been now gained in the implementation rules. So these achievements have a potential to change the way the budget is functioning. And last but not least, I believe in force of precedence in the European budget, and that even if the Next Generation EU has been designed as a one-off instrument, it will change. It actually has already changed the way we think and talk about the European budget. And for the European Parliament, it is important, it's crucial now to secure relevant role in these negotiations, in the new negotiations that actually start already now, and to be able to act for the benefit of the European regions and cities and citizens. Thank you very much. I will be very happy to discuss it all and answer your questions. Thank you.
Magdalena, thank you very much indeed for that presentation again, really clear, and it's good to get your first-hand insights into particularly the role of the Parliament and how it brought about its influence. So again, a virtual round of applause. Lots of interesting issues to emerge again, also from what you've been saying. So let's open things up for questions and discussion. Just as a reminder that Wolfgang has put in the chat a link to the Jacques Delors publication that he mentioned that's come out today. Okay. Do you want to either raise your hand, or if you've got your video on, I'll see if I can see you, but we've already got one hand raised from David Brew. David.
Thanks, John. Very interesting presentations. I was struck by what was said about the DG6 approach to the agricultural rural development support. And I can recall the very fraught arguments in the past about trying to ensure that measures were coordinated between the Rural Fund and the Regional Development Fund. I wonder if I could ask for any more comments about why it was that DG6 was successful in its approach, what the balance between Regio and Agri was in the early process, and why the Parliament was unsuccessful in ensuring that the Rural Development Fund shouldn't be brought within the overall coordination mechanism. If an insight could be given into what, on the face of it, I would regard as a wholly retrograde step, it would be very helpful to know.
Thanks very much, David. Good to hear some references to Directorate Generals in old money, DG6, which some of us still remember. But yes, really, I think an important point as to how the configuration of policy to headings has developed regulatory to the regulations. Who'd like to take that on?
If I can just briefly comment on it, because these things you only know when you are part of DG16 in old money and DG5, so regio and employment. What I know is that I think until a couple of weeks only before the proposal was made by then Budget Commissioner Günther Oettinger, DG Regio, who is always leading on these processes, especially on the drafting of the Common Provisions Regulation, that would be the common roof for the Rural Development Fund, they were still believing that they remain under the roof. And they were just told, no, we aren't. And then, as I said, DG Agriculture and Rural Development went their own ways, including of prolonging in high commas the current period to a high degree. I don't know why the Parliament wasn't successful, but the Committee of the Regions, as I said, maybe was definitely also in favor, and I think so are all the experts. And this goes back to very old days when I can say there's a certain, how can I say, the Commission is not a monolithic block, as all of you probably know. And no DG likes to be masterminded by any other DG. So it goes really back to when there was once upon a time DG22, who was coordinating all the funds, and they were just abolished because everybody hated them so much and they had no chance to survive. And then DG Regio came into this driver's seat. I think it's about safeguarding the budget, safeguarding the influence, and then arguing that they have very different and special tasks to solve in the rural areas. That's possibly the official narrative on this. But maybe Magdalena knows more why it wasn't possible at all to get also the Committee on Agriculture and Rural Development in the Parliament aligning or putting pressure on DG6, as it were.
No, unfortunately, I didn't follow negotiations in agriculture and all the structure there. I cannot really add anything to this.
Okay, thank you. Thank you both. You're right. It's almost bizarre that in the weeks leading up to May 2018, that there were these discussions: is ESF in? Is it out? Rural development in or out? And almost quite casually, one of the principles of cohesion policy, of the coordination of the funds, was significantly affected. But I think one interesting issue that you mentioned is the way in which the perceived importance of cohesion policy changed in the course of the negotiation, and being associated, if you like, with the ERDF and ESF was not necessarily seen as positive. Thank you for that question, David. We have Serafin Passos Vidal.
Hello. Thank you for this excellent discussion. It's great to see some well-known colleagues, and this budget is probably one of the best documented ones, the negotiations, thanks to the work of the EPRC, the work of EPRS, and for the wider public, the role that Wolfgang does in actually tweeting all this incredible source of information, making our life easier as researchers. I actually, it's good because I'm coming back on the same issue as the previous question. I mean, I'm actually doing an article now on tracing that, why Agri went away and how it happened. Perhaps the best description of that, how that happened, was given by Nicola de Michelis in the presentation of the EPRC in Delft like 2 years ago. And it pains me that I thought that meeting was recorded, because that was an absolute document about how the negotiations had gone from the very beginning, the first proposals up until then. But this is where we are. It is bad, and I actually want to make a question on that. I mean, the question of the territorialization of cohesion policy and the other policies, because the next generation EU, it's based on cohesion policy legal base. It's based in some of the legal basis, actually, like the regulation zone is the same. But in reality, it's not going to be a territorial policy. And in a way, it's a critique of the rationale of cohesion policy. It's actually all the things that cohesion policy seems not to be able to do, or member states would like to do otherwise, more centralized and so on. So to which extent, because we didn't talk much in the presentation, which was very useful on next generation, but to which extent is this a rival for cohesion policy or not? I mean, just general reaction, because I think that's something quite the big piece in the debate, I would say, from now on onwards. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Serafin.
If I may come, yeah, sorry.
Wolfgang, go ahead.
Magdalena, go. Thanks for the remarks, Serafin. It's indeed something I didn't want to picture or to highlight too much, but I also do think that, to quote the headline of one of the EPRC regulation publications recently, will cohesion policy recover from COVID-19, or basically from the threat that the Recovery and Resilience Facility is putting on it? And that's really the elephant in the room, I'd say. And it has come a long way, like any other thing. It hasn't fallen from the sky. It hasn't even started only with the thinking around the repair or the reaction to the COVID-19 pandemic. There have been some ideas floating around in DG Regio, and I can also point to the Director General himself, who is a big fan of payment for results. And that is a radical change to what cohesion policy has done over the last nearly 40 years. Payment for results. And that's the way in which payments will be done by the Recovery and Resilience Facility. So you don't have to collect, how can I say, invoices anymore as a fund manager, what you usually do anyway. But you have, speaking about the most important region in Germany, which is, of course, the free Hanseatic city of Bremen, where I'm from, we have to count in the future, if we want any money from this facility, how much are we able to reduce our CO2 emissions? And I wonder who does this in Bremen. I'm really not sure about it. And I'm really not sure whether this makes sense. And they have tested that, Regio has tested that in a couple of programs, and I think you will be aware of that in Austria, where they have some first results. But now for this amount, without a clear absorption structure, I mean, it has lasted like 20 years to build up these structures in many, many regions to absorb cohesion money, and it is still a tricky issue. But now changing the system from payment for costs, basically, to payment for political somewhere up in the air results, and paying 100%. Paying 100% out for that. This is a real threat to cohesion policy. I'm not saying that it will wash away the hundreds of words and tens of tons of pages of all the regulations. I don't believe that. But it will cause changes. It will put more pressure on a more simplified, and maybe in the future, a completely results-based system also for cohesion policy, if the RRF will be successful, which is still to be seen, of course. So it's really interesting to watch this, and I can only recommend to do more in-depth research, and I'm quite sure that the EPRC and the EPRS are both after this. And I would very much like something that Magdalena has highlighted already, that one of the positive negotiation results on the RRF regulation, which is the only one that is public already, was to add a scoreboard on where the money goes and when the payments are done to the implementation, something that wasn't initially in the Commission proposal. So that's quite good for transparency reasons.
Okay, thank you very much, Wolfgang. Magdalena, do you want to add to that?
Yes, well, in this topic about performance conditionality, which is also in the title of our meeting, I think that this is here to stay, and this performance and looking at the results, payments based on results and so on, this will be a direction that the whole spending, the whole budget will now go. And when I followed the discharge procedure in this area where the Parliament has a lot of actually competences, it has changed enormously in recent years. So we don't check so much compliance, you know, how much the rules we followed, how strictly we followed the rules, but also very much what we have achieved. And the European Court of Auditors this year, in its assessment of spending for the year 2019, so in the discharge procedure for 2019, presented for the first time a special performance report, which is attached to the annual usual report on spending. And there it goes in depth, you know, of this kind of analysis and presentation, and the Parliament is very much supporting. So performance-based budgeting results, and I think with the NGEU enormous money, we have a chance to do something better in this respect.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much, both Magdalena and Wolfgang. Other questions, comments? I'm just looking to see any blue hands. Okay. Yes, Christian.
Hi, everyone. It's nice to see you all, and thank you to Wolfgang and Magdalena for this very interesting presentation. Probably, you know, maybe to just continue a bit with this discussion, you know, because I was wondering how, because Wolfgang, you did send and you did hint that there might be several absorption related problems. I was curious how you assess that and kind of the, you know, the link between the traditional MFF and the next generation EU funds, and also the short timeline that is, you know, available. And on the conditionality issue, because this is something I've been looking into as well, I was curious how you assess the functionality of the new conditionality mechanism on the rule of law as it stands now and as it was adopted into the regulations. So thank you.
Okay, two interesting questions there. Who'd like to start? Would either of you like to pick up on Christian's question?
Maybe I can start with the issue of absorption. Well, in this, indeed, in this, it's a big issue, I think now, and we really have to be very careful with this big money, because when we look at the numbers today, indeed, Wolfgang mentioned this, that Eulalia Rubio, one of our colleagues also dealing with the budget, presented this publication and showed that, for example, in Poland, in total, all subsidies only, which will be available, cohesion policy and the next generation EU will exceed, will represent almost 18% of total GDP in the country. So in Spain, it will be more than 8%. You know, this is really huge money, and I think that the absorption, taking into account also is an issue, taking into account also that we still have about half of the budget unspent from the previous MFF. I recently checked the cohesion numbers on the Commission's website, which you are, I'm sure, familiar with as well. And it said that there is only so far 45% covered, so spent, yeah, payments. And so this is really, yeah, still a big chunk of budget that has to be spent. So only this bit worrying comment. And about the rule of law, the second part of your question, here the Parliament, the result is, I heard several opinions, comments from lawyers. They don't agree, you know. Some of them say, oh, it's much better document now, it has been improved very much and it will work. And some others said, no, it's still not detailed enough, it's just you know, window dressing and so on. I think we'll see in practice it's better than nothing. And one could also be surprised then that we at all didn't have something like this before, you know. So that it's only now we have a rule of law linked to the disbursement of EU funds. So I can tell you from the perspective of the Parliament, obviously, that the improvements included the broadened definition of breaches of the rule of law, that the financial beneficiaries are protected in a better way. I'm not sure to what extent it will indeed protect the interests of the beneficiaries in practice, but according to the final document, there will be a possibility to file a complaint to the Commission if the money doesn't flow anymore to the beneficiaries. Then there will be preventive mechanism triggered if serious risk of breach happens, and there will be shorter deadlines for action than the Commission proposed, and suspended commitments can be transferred up to year N+2. So this rule N+2 will be included. So there were the improvements that the Parliament managed to gain in the negotiations.
Okay, thank you very much, Magdalena. Wolfgang, do you want to add anything to that?
Not much indeed. I think that is a very relevant question, of course, that Christian has asked. And I'd say that we are in the area of speculation. Whether or not it will be absorbed is that only the future can tell. But all the figures have been out. And on the rule of law, here I have probably a rather radical view that is a very personal one at the same time. Some articles have been published on the usefulness of linking the EU budget to the rule of law. And like Magdalena just said about the lawyers, there are divergent views on this. Some people say that there is no real link between the two, especially not when it comes to cohesion policy. Others would possibly more politically argue that there is really a link, and that the EU cannot pay for regimes, for example, that breach these laws and breach EU values. I'd say the following on cohesion policy. Like with the European semester, like with any other thing that you hang around cohesion policy's neck, if you read again Article 174, it's about inequalities between regions, and it is not about the rule of law, and it is not about anything else. So I'd say if I could make a wish to the European Union and to cohesion policy in particular, a wish that never will be fulfilled, I'd say, why are you always looking for good reasons to continue the policy? You have already a very good reason in the treaty, and that means that you have to look into the ironing out regional inequalities. So I would imagine that the future of cohesion policy in that sense, let's say more on the just and fair side of EU policies, would say we look into ironing out these inequalities, we look into the reasons, which of course they do, but the conditionality is whether or not exactly these inequalities are addressed properly and successfully. So imagine a European semester that would tell Germany, hey, you have a payment gap between men and women, close this gap by the end of the next decade. Otherwise, you wouldn't get any funding anymore. Okay, Germany would probably not jump on this, but you have a lot of things that you could imagine under conditionality that is linked to the very, very objective that this policy was invented for. And it was not invented for serving a European semester or any other thing. So it's an overload, I'd say, and it's a sign for over-politicization of policies that have nothing to do with the problem.
Okay, thank you very much. Just a comment on what you said about earlier about and it links to what you just said just now. If one looks at cohesion policy, you said all these things that are hung around the neck of the policy, and over time, you know, as we've said before, there are these layers of complexity that have built up because in response to criticism, and in each case, the development of the performance framework, development of conditionalities, going back to the decommitment rule and so on, have evolved with a fair amount of thought and testing to differing degrees. Now you compare that to the RRF, and I don't think it's any secret that in the SecGen they're having to make things up as they go along at very short notice, whether it's you know, for example, to do with evaluation. And you look at evaluation and it's something that David Brew would recognize from the 1990s. I mean, you think, what? What is this? What has happened to the debate about performance and so on? And also how you get good spending. But the problem is, I think, politically, is that the RF can't be allowed to fail. And it's a bit like the InvestEU. I mean, it's whatever it does, whatever it doesn't do, it will need to be seen as a success. Unlike cohesion policy, which arguably doesn't have, well, not arguably, it doesn't have that same political capital and resonance. So I think we're in for using the Chinese interpretation of the term, we're in for an interesting time as we go forward. Okay, any final comments? Perhaps a little more optimistic than my one. Okay, any final comments that either of you, Wolfgang or Magdalena, would like to make?
No, again, big thanks to you, John, to Liliana, and also to the whole team of EPRS and EPRC. Maybe you should join the company under one common roof, for which you would have to negotiate quite considerably, I imagine. No, but seriously, I like very much to continue this debate, not me myself, but I could see that, for example, on the last point, where do all these, I think they are now called commission notes, out of a sudden come from, and what is their legitimacy? One should invite the colleagues from that you know so well, Elisa or Eric from the SecGen, and try to ask them these questions. I'm not so sure whether they will respond quickly and positively, because they are very much, as you said, under pressure, and they have a lot of work to do. But I think this debate requires transparency, and I also believe that, Magda, you said that in April or May, the Parliament is doing similar efforts in the form of webinars or seminars to shed more light on what happened and what should happen. Maybe that's my final thing. And always watch the website of the Committee of the Regions. You never know whether we have good things to offer, so you better be in our loop as well. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Wolfgang. And Magdalena?
Just, yes, some words to thank you, and indeed emphasize this. I would like to emphasize this transparency of data. We really struggle in the Parliament sometimes, also at the EPRS, to get figures, the numbers. So whenever we have something, we publish this for the members, for the broader public, and I really think that this kind of events that you organize and everything what we publish helps to understand the whole process and the outcome, and this is very, very important, and I hope it will continue. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Magdalena. I think on that note of transparency, I hope you've noticed in the chat that there is now a two-person campaign from Serafin Passos-Vidal and Stefan Carr to try and persuade DG Agri to to keep open data information on the EFRD in future. Well, thank you very much, both of you. We do actually have in mind to tempt Eric or Eric von Breska or Elisa Roller after April, when they have a slightly less pressure to contribute to this debate about the RRF. And this is certainly an issue that will continue, and I think we'll have much more to talk about. But thank you both for the very interesting presentations, the work you put in terms of trying to provide synthetic overviews to make it comprehensible of where we are in terms of different dimensions of the new policy framework, both in terms of the MFF and specifically about where cohesion policy sits. And thank you also for participating in the very interesting discussion. Thank you to everyone who's participated in listening or speaking mode. We hope you found it interesting. And as I said at the beginning, you'll find the information on our website following the presentations and the recording following this. Our next webinar will take place on the 3rd of March when Dr. Alexandra Bulat, research associate, recently joined the University of Strathclyde, will present on how local level contact shapes attitudes towards EU migrants, particularly in the EU context, the UK context. Please use the same contact email used to register for this webinar to register for our mailing list. We have a really interesting program ahead of other webinars up until the summer, and we hope to see you again then. So thank you again to Wolfgang and to Magdalena. Thank you to you all, and all the best and take care. Thank you very much indeed.